Instagram has my number in terms of targeted ads. I cannot tell you the number of things that I have bought off of Instagram ads. It's because they've collected enough data in terms of my behaviors using the app, the things that I interact with, the things that I am passing over. And they're able to use that to say, okay, great. Not only can we send the right type of content to Tim, we can also send the right types of ads where Tim's most likely going to buy. Even though we've got a number of commercial organizations that are dealing with massive amounts of data, government's still pretty far ahead on the amount of data that they're collecting.
Welcome to the Startup Defense. My name is Callye Keen. Today I have Tim Tutt. Tim is an expert at data analytics, has a lot of experience in the government space, showing organizations how best to use their data, unlocking value. And honestly, Tim, I'm not the expert here. I am here to learn, and I'm really excited for this conversation for that reason. Before we dive into the technical details, I'd like the audience to get a good feel for you. What's the story of Tim? What are you passionate about right now?
Sure. Well, hey, thanks so much, Callye, for having me on. I'm excited to be here and chat with you. So my background, I come from the government space. I spent the last 15 years of my career operating inside the U.S. intelligence community, really focused on how we do large-scale data exploitation and search and discovery. That's kind of where I started, from a career background. I played middleman between my end users and their data. I was the guy that people would come to and ask questions and say, hey, we're looking for particular individual, particular location, particular patterns or things of interest that we can find to take the next action, take the next step, put an X on the ground wherever we particularly need to go. And I'd go and write queries, run those against a massive supercomputer, and come back with answers for, our end users. And that became, a bit of a repetitive cycle. That's kind of one of the things that prompted me to launch out and start the company that I run now, Night Shift Development, where we're really trying to help democratize access to data and data analytics. How do we help enable people to get value from their data without needing to have this deep technical background? Large part of the way we do that is with our core product, Clear Query, which is designed to make it super simple. We kind of joke that it's, Siri meets your data, but, it's making analytics so simple that anyone can do it no matter what their technical skill level is.
That's fantastic. I've got a number of friends in commercial data, just call it that, and played around with R and some of the tools that are available in that space. And I have a little bit of a coding background, definitely technical background. It's a pretty high, let's say, barrier to entry business to get into. And so I think a lot of companies, whether they're commercial or defense, they also don't understand the value of the data that they have or the best way to solve a problem, because it's often counterintuitive what needs to be measured or where the data could be inferred. Not only is the tools fairly complex, so it requires, some skills and some training, and then the underlying math, of course, can be fairly difficult as well, right? But then there's a creative element to it, thinking through that problem. Well, what kind of data do I need? Have you seen that creativity really play out in the space?
Yeah, this is one of the interesting things. I think in the government space in particular, I found that we're collecting mass amounts of data. There's usually lots of interesting data laying around somewhere, being collected, siphoned off into some silo. And usually it's this big challenge of figuring out what that data is and how it melds with other data. I think you're right that in a lot of organizations, you do have groups of people that don't even understand what data they need to get started. They know they need data. Everyone's kind of heard this, data's the new oil. We need to be drilling in. We need to be exploiting it in a better way. But not everyone really knows how to capture that data, clean it, which is, another big factor when you're talking about doing data analysis, data exploitation in general, making sure that data is engineered in a way that you can actually even get value from it. But I think the other thing that you do tend to find is people that understand their business, that understand what it is that they're driving at in general, whether that's commercial or defense space. Those subject matter experts, they know the right questions to ask. They may not know how to get the data, may not know, where that data comes from, but they do know that, I know these are the questions I need answers to, and I know there are going to be follow-ups. I know this is going to be a conversational and iterative process for me to get the right value out of it. So a lot of times, what we end up doing when we first come into an organization, it's A, helping them understand what data they have, B, helping them get that cleaned and engineered in the right way. And then, Clear Query is there for that analysis piece. The long tail of it is getting to that data storytelling aspect. How do we then turn that into actionable insights so that we can make the right decisions and make the right investments that we need to, and figure out what the next best action is and present that to the right decision makers at the end of the day. And that's a lot of what we try to do as an organization. So our core product, Clear Query, helps to solve a lot of those problems within the government space, within commercial space. You do have these earlier parts of this data story, like you just mentioned, finding the right data, and then B, making sure it's set up for you to even do that analysis in the first place.
Yeah, this is very key. This is a good time to have this conversation because we're building next generation sensor systems. We're taking in a lot of data, in some cases more data than you'd think per second would even live on a computer, and then we're trying to ingest and augment and move that data, transport it in a number of places. It's incredibly important what you're talking about, and I'd like to unpack that a little bit as much as makes, let's say, public sense.
Sure.
I'll just give a very easy commercial example. It's like, I've been developing products for 15 years. We've been making things my entire life. And 10 years ago, to make a new sensor system, we might go through spins and spins. And in knowing exactly what we were going to capture was so critical. Knowing how we would use that data later, we might have some discoverability, but now it's very easy to just deliver a kit where I can pull in any type of data, any type of sensor system, and reconfigure it and pull in so much, like putting out an Arduino out into an environment and just start siphoning in environmental data or whatever have you. This is, we're just getting started in data acquisition and then in ingesting it at edge. But then this is going to put so much more pressure on you in night shift, because as it's easier to acquire data or build the systems to acquire data, that story has to be more and more refined because you're just making more of a mess versus getting intelligible information.
You're not wrong. And, this is one of the things that we tend to look at broadly is it's this data triage process, right? So data analysis, data exploitations it's also about this triage. How do I filter down to the data that actually matters? One of the things that I tend to kind of really look at, especially when you move into the world of streaming data or data at the edge, is, what types of capabilities can we also put at the edge to filter that data in a meaningful way so that we only look at the things that matter? Sure, you're collecting lots of data. Maybe it's data coming from Wi-Fi networks or data coming about, weather sensors. What actually matters in that data for the type of analysis we're trying to do? Do we only care about major events? And you could actually even think about this from a cybersecurity standpoint. Alert fatigue is a major issue with most of the cybersecurity platforms that you have out there. I've got thousands and thousands of alerts coming out, but most of them don't actually matter. Most of them are just, standard, hey, this is activity happening, but it looks anomalous because the systems haven't really refined themselves yet, haven't really fine-tuned to a point where they can really only highlight the really interesting bits for you. Same thing, whether it's, a sensor that you're collecting data on, maybe I only have certain targets of interest that I care about. Let's whittle down to those. Or maybe I care about those targets of interest in their secondary networks. So from an overall data analysis perspective, there's a handful of things that you want to look at. It's, the streaming data, how we make sure that we're only capturing and analyzing the data that we really, really care about, and everything else maybe we want to store for later, just in case we want to, do some other deep analysis on that for broader atmospherics. Not everyone needs everything. You only need, the small universe of the world that you care about at any given time. And I think this is a thing that we have to get better about as we're building these solutions, not just collecting the data, but helping people to find those solutions to triage that data up front before they even start doing their own analysis on it.
Yeah, so this is a good avenue to go down on a conversation of data transport. And whenever you transport something, we're talking about bandwidth, but we're also talking about security issues. So the classic example of this is I can send HD video all the way, backhaul it and transport it wherever it's going to go. Or I can just say, hey, I need a bounding box around X. I already have GIS information. I don't need a HD video stream of this thing. Or do I, right? Or do I need to store it and do further actionable information? But until they work with somebody like yourself and understand what the data is, right now it's how many HD streams of video can I ingest into a tactical edge computer and how fast can I transport that data. And I see that as a security issue, but that's from my background. I see it as a security issue, but it's also an intelligible or actionable data issue. So if they talk to you and say, I need this person right at the edge to have this data as fast as possible, we need to isolate just what's the smallest increment of that to take action on and then worry about all that other fun stuff later.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Edge computing is becoming, more and more of a hot topic, right? You're starting to see that more in the government space. Every now and then you'll see, RFIs come out. But I'd even say in the commercial spaces, you're seeing that. Chick-fil-A, for instance, they launched, I think there was a blog post a while back that says they run the largest Kubernetes cluster in the world. And it's because they have these individual pods deployed at every Chick-fil-A location. But each one of those locations is doing its own analysis and can tell you down to the second, hey, here's a perfect amount of cook time that you need to make sure this chicken is, nice and crispy, etc. And the number of individuals that are coming in that store, what their revenue is, and they can do all that prediction at the edge. Meanwhile, they aggregate that data on the back end for all of the stores to determine, globally how they want to operate. That's fascinating. And that's actually what we should be doing, on a defense side as well. We operate in so many different AORs and we care about these small portions of the world and what's happening there with the data that we're collecting in that localized environment. Well, how do we then help enable those individuals at that edge to get the analysis that they need very, very quickly and then ship back all the data later for the broader global analysis, right? How do I make sure that at a border crossing, we can identify, someone that's concerning and of interest in a particular arena, but also gather all that data later for broader analysis when we're looking for interesting ways to get into networks across the board there.
We could probably extend this Chick-fil-A conversation and come up with some interesting parallels, but turning that to machine vision, let's say their drive-through. And it's like, okay, well, at edge, we want to do plate scrubbing because we don't want that data. We want to do head count. We want to do instance count so we can make predictive analysis of, okay, this is how many people we need out there with their little clipboards like they do. But also, I need immediate actionable information to headquarters of like aberrant conditions, right? It's like, okay, this took a really long time. The dwell time was really high, or somebody moved in a way that's not normal. What was the issue? Or somebody had a car accident there. What's the issue? This is why we launched this podcast, because you'll see people do interesting things in commercial markets because there's immediate dollars to be made there. Right? So if you wanted to implement that solution, well, Chick-fil-A has already done it, but if you wanted to implement that solution, like there's AI boards right now where they could do right out of the box, open source plate scrubbing, CV of cars, car counting, face grabbing, sentiment analysis on the faces, all kinds of crazy stuff. It's actually not that difficult to do anymore. What we see is every time that we have this condition or somebody that wants to do something in commercial, there's a 10x need in defense. Yep. We have all the same problems, but in commercial, like if they wanted to roll out and say, we want more computing power, we're just going to put it out on Chick-fil-A's, they're all domestic. It's not going to be that big of a deal to just upgrade systems or upgrade their servers, whereas defense, that might be absolutely impossible.
So, yeah, and it becomes more challenging, especially when you talk about mission critical areas where we have low access to begin with. Hey, maybe even getting the thing into a particular location was hard to begin with, let alone getting something updated, even if that's transporting across the network, because you don't want to become alerting in an environment where it's, particularly dangerous, where you could be caught.
Chick-fil-A is not worried about highly contested environments, right? They're not. Yeah, we have a Wi-Fi and GPS denied fast food. It's not really an issue, but that's like an everyday upfront issue that we would deal with. And then it really just comes down to the best thing is when there's no data at rest and we're transporting as little as possible. So it's like knowing what data we should use is upfront is critical.
Absolutely. And this is where, AI and machine learning capabilities, at the edge become more and more critical. And then on top of that, making those AI and machine learning capabilities small enough, compact enough that you can deploy at the edge. Because sometimes if you're talking about an Arduino, if you're talking about small interface, you don't have much storage space to begin with, much compute power to begin with. Can I actually run this algorithm on the device that I am deploying at the edge? That becomes, a major consideration. So I think you're exactly right. A lot of the commercial problems do get 10x in the government space, especially when you start factoring in the security concerns and security controls around it, but then also the other constraints that we have to operate in. Then you factor in who's the user of that device. I'm not always going to have data scientist, data engineer at the edge. I need to be able to help enable my operator to be able to use this thing and then also handle the failures on the back. That's one of the biggest challenges that, we run into. Hey, this thing breaks. I don't have time to wait for someone to kind of walk me through it. I need to either be able to fix it or move on because we have, things to do and we need to move on, or it puts us in a bad position. So understanding those challenges, this, becomes more important the more dangerous the mission set is. But those things do occur and exist. And that's where it's most critical for us to have these technologies available at the end of the day.
Good design needs good constraints. So
absolutely,
we're headed towards good design, I suppose. Hey, I wanted to ask you, because I'm on your LinkedIn and I saw that you have worked with Decode. And so we've had Meg Vorlin on the show. I've mentioned to you, I'm a big fan of what Decode's been able to do. And it fits kind of my dual use thesis is like, okay, if we start as a defense company, we should look at how we can scale with commercial applications. If we're thinking about a commercial company, we should think about how we can serve, our country. Think of like, what's my first customer? Because, in startup world, they're like, find that beachhead customer. I'm like, what better beachhead customer than somebody who's actually going to, actually breach a beachhead, And, like, okay, come on, like, let's be serious about this. But no, they're like, okay, early adopters would be willing to cut a check for your thing to exist. Early adopters would be willing to co-develop something for you, or they have a 10x problem to be had. And I think in every case that I've come across, they're really describing dual use. Yeah, I just wanted to dive into that, your interaction with Decode and that experience. How's that been for you?
One, I worked for Decode for a long time in a couple of different capacities, so happy to dive into that. Big shout out to Meg Borland, who you mentioned, and Megan Metzger and Rebecca DeVault, who are, over there running different parts of, that organization. So, Decode's core mission, right, is to help bring commercial technologies to government, but also they kind of have a dual mission, which is how do we help government understand how to identify and bring in the right technology, which I think is a very critical and missing piece. Oftentimes government, for the longest time, the government was the, most innovative place for new technology. We were, doing things that you don't see in commercial spaces. And that's still true in a lot of respects. But as data becomes more prevalent in the commercial sector, as people become a lot more interested, there's a lot of innovation happening in the commercial world that the government needs to be able to leverage, but oftentimes moves way too slow to leverage. And this becomes a big issue, especially for smaller companies that don't understand government buying cycles, that have investors that are pressuring them to drive and get revenue quickly and don't necessarily know how to move through the wickets of government. So what Decode's doing is basically connecting the government individuals that, hey, we know we need technology, we need innovative things. We just don't know how to, maneuver through the process and the wickets to get this done faster or fast enough. And then on the flip side, commercial companies that are driving in, that have innovative tech and want to do business with the government. We started working with Decode, this was back in 2020 when we launched our sales team, and most of my sales team had only sold commercially. So wanted to help them understand how to run through the buying cycle. So we got our team kind of spun up there. Since then, I've also become a limited partner with Decode Capital. So, I'm on the other side helping to invest in companies that are trying to get into the government space. For me, that's hyper exciting because having worked in the government for a long time, I can see a lot of interesting use cases that, I want to help plug these companies into that I wish, we had in the past. Yep. So jumped in as an LP with Decode Capital and have been really excited to work with some of the companies coming in and helping to drive that, because looking back in my days on the government side, bringing in some of that tech, things that I wish we had before, things that I wish we could actually do something with, it's nice to see that actually working out in a good way for us.
We've had a number of VCs on the show, all different sizes, angels. We've had some of the team from Shield Capital on. This is very interesting because we've had people from AAL and different organizations that they've gone from working in the IC or DoD. They've gone through acquisition and kind of seen that whole rigmarole. And then they've gone in and maybe been a contractor, and then they've become a part of the whole startup world or VC piece. And so I love what you're saying, because it's a common through line is, to me, I've spent my whole life in defense, making things for defense. It's still kind of a mystery to me. You learn something new or things evolve, like they've evolved in the past few years with DIU and AFWorks and the different programs, and really evolved. Even how SBIR's work is evolving right now. And so there's a lot to learn is all I'm saying. It's not as easy as like I get my LLC and put out my digital shingle and start working. So your experience is like invaluable for these startups.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I really love about it is there's so much cool tech out there, but unless you understand the government use cases, it becomes really hard for you to sell that to the government. And this is one of the things I love about Decode is they do really help organizations figure that out along the way. Here's how we help you find the government use case, undersell to government, because selling to government isn't about, hey, how many dollars are we going to make at the end of the day? You do have other factors that matter. Hey, how do we save time on this particular mission? How do we help find an answer that isn't easily findable, something that's a needle in the haystack? Even though we've got a number of commercial organizations that are dealing with massive amounts of data, government's still pretty far ahead on the amount of data that they're collecting. And the needles that they're trying to find are much more interesting and much harder to find. So how do we drill in and deal with that? Then on top of that, how do we handle the obscure security issues that the government has to deal with that most organizations don't? ATOs, FedRAMP, et cetera, that's a whole separate process. And if you have no idea what any of those letters mean, it's a different beast. So, Decode's doing a very good job of helping organizations to drive into this space in a very effective way, and helping innovative technology companies bring those capabilities to the government space to solve some of the most interesting and important problems that we face as a nation.
I always joke because tech likes to develop its own jargon. You use words in a different way, but I'm also in manufacturing. So manufacturing has its whole own universe of words, but then defense is the king of acronyms and jargons. And somebody says, oh, this is like, ATO, authority to operate, CSO, then POM, and then this, and you're like, is POM an agency or is it it's like, okay, like, what is this? What is that? And so it's this whole language that people need to get up to speed. And I think the old method of this was, well, I'm going to have to go and hire somebody from DoD and put them on my advisory team or put them in the C-suite because they know all this vocabulary and they kind of know how to navigate. But now we have organizations, community organizations, venture organizations, and then new now, and I think really developing these innovation organizations within the community, like within DoD, even within the IC, reaching out and saying like, hey, we're going to help you get in here and figure out what to do, where to go, who to talk to, what's important.
Absolutely. And you're starting to see that a lot more. It's a thing that the government's been lagging behind on. Yeah, you're right. Even certain IC organizations, CIA now has a group that is designed to go out and find innovative technology companies. They are the front door for anyone wanting to bring interesting technology to the agency. It's typically getting the agency, unless you know that space and unless you really know, you're not getting in. There's a high barrier for entry for good reason. It absolutely is something that, hey, there's still things that we need and want to take advantage of. How do we do this in an effective way?
Yeah, you don't want everybody pitching InQtel all the time.
Right.
I have like the slightly important things to do other than every inventor saying, I've got a cool idea. Listen to me. I want to be a good advocate for innovators that are listening to the show and help them understand what you do and why. If they're making a tech product, let's say that I have a new sensor product or I have a new compute product, and I'm listening to my customers' mission profiles or their user story, right? This is what we're thinking about doing. Why should they double down in thinking about how to use data? There's a company that commercially came out, they had an app, their app failed, and this is in the DC region. Their app failed, but they realized that they had created a great way to pull data, and their company shifted over to doing just that because the purpose of their app was no good, but what they were able to do with the data that they were pulling from their app was so valuable that it could be acquired. I think that when you say data is the new oil, a lot of people are just like Jeb Clampett or something. They're just walking around. They don't know that they're sitting on this giant wealth of potential value. I want to just talk about that really quickly because this is something I very, very rarely see people thinking about. How can I add additional value with my products or my systems through data?
Sure. No, that's a fantastic point. And you're right. There are a number of groups out there that collect a lot of data that they don't even do anything with, and they really could, because that could be its own business line, if not its own company. There's an interesting company I was talking to maybe a month and a half ago where they built a new chatbot interface, and this chatbot interface is designed, using ChatGPT and a couple of things, but it's designed to, mimic a friend. And what was interesting about it was they launched this platform and ran a couple of ads, got a bunch of folks using it, it's kind of a test bed, and had hundreds of thousands of messages over the first couple of days within the app of, hey, here's things that people are asking, and here's how the chatbot's responding, and here's what they're asking. And I'm like, that's your value right there. Your value is the data that you're collecting on what people are asking, what they're interested in. You can take that and you can start to derive really interesting things from it. Hey, here's some interesting buyer personas, people that are interested in these things, or here's something that we can target to an individual. This is one of the things I talk about often when I talk about data. I look at Instagram, for instance, right? Instagram has my number in terms of targeted ads. I cannot tell you the number of things that I have bought off of Instagram ads. It's not Amazon for me. It's the Instagram ads.
I'm guilty as well.
Right. But it's because they've collected enough data in terms of my behaviors using the app, the things that I interact with, the things that I am passing over. And they're able to use that to say, okay, great. Not only can we send the right type of content to Tim, we can also send the right types of ads where Tim's most likely going to buy, or he's at least going to click on these ads, which is where Instagram generates their revenue at the end of the day. And now all of a sudden, they build an even better profile for me of, hey, these are the things that Tim really cares about. That kind of targeting and user behavior is hyper interesting. But then you think about it from all these other perspectives. Let's say you're talking about sensors on a car or a vehicle. What are the driving patterns of an individual? How can we increase the safety and the mechanics of this vehicle so that it drives a lot more effectively? I think Tesla and all these cars that now have all of these telemetry sensors, built in them that are being shipped back to the mothership. That is going to help us develop and build more effective cars or more safe cars for the consumers on the road. So there's a million different ways that you can leverage even just a user's behaviors of the application or the sensor that you have to derive new data that becomes really interesting to leverage in other perspectives. Then you think about that from government perspective as well. Even looking at ad data, where people are spending their time, where they are. How do we get to them in the most effective ways? It becomes a really, really interesting, see for people, no matter where you are. So yes, data is the new oil, and a lot of people are collecting data that they just aren't doing anything with. And that's what one of the things that we want to do is help enable them to get value from that data, or at least start seeing interesting trends without needing to know much about how to analyze it. throw your data into, our platform, and it will help you identify some of those insights. But yes, absolutely. It's just a key goal of, if you got data, you want to be analyzing it, because there's going to be some nugget in there that you can use for whether that's more profits or better improvement of an overall system, whatever that is. There's a lot of different ways to leverage it in an effective way.
I'll give two examples. And one, when I've helped commercial startups, this is common in e-commerce, is like, hey, I'm going to use some different trend analysis tools, right? I'm going to go look at Google searches, and I'm going to go look at who actually cares about this. So yeah, you could look at hashtags, you could look at the keywords that are built, or just content on YouTube. So like, are people actually talking about the thing that I'm going after? And hopefully that graph looks like it's going up and to the right, that people are caring about this more and more. We use this to find good government problems as well, but just on the, what kind of SBIRs are getting funded, or like what kind of programs are people putting out there, or what kind of pitches were accepted in XYZ event, right? Or what topics were people speaking about at XYZ industry event or trade organization? Like, who's speaking and what are they talking about? So we can infer problems and stories from this. And what I want to pull from that is my second example is, I look at that and then think, okay, well, if I'm building, I have a little wireless retransmission device, right? We put accelerometer and GPS on it. And it's like, well, why do that? And like, well, because there's a ton of things that you can get inferred data off of an accelerometer. I can know quality of transmission. And if you don't want it, you don't want it. But like, I know from looking at those stories, who's talking about what, is there's a lot of potential applications for that data. I need to go out and talk to somebody like yourself, or I need to go and look at the speeches at those conventions and say, okay, well, I have this ability to gather additional data. Like, what can I do with this thing that I have that I'm not thinking about? I just want to double down on this, because I've seen this repeatedly be a problem, is somebody's creating a product and it's okay, but from a data perspective, it's excellent. They're just not monetizing or selling that as the actual product itself.
Absolutely. Just kind of double down on your point. Yes, there's a lot of different interesting, I love some of the kind of the use cases you were talking about, looking at, one of the things that we look at, for instance, is USA spending data every now and then, because then you can start to see trends of organizations that are investing in interesting technologies. But on the flip side, there are a lot of government organizations that are looking at that and saying, are we spending too much with a particular vendor, with a particular subcontractor? Are we spending too much in a particular arena? Because if we are, hey, if we have 8 different organizations buying the same type of technology, should that be consolidated somewhere, or is it actually needed? Or is there a better way for us to buy and procure these things? Are there other interesting things that we can look at there? Is there particular language in contracts that we should be, extracting and evaluating for how we go after business with the government? But also from the government's perspective, are there things that they need to be looking at in proposals that seem to be high indicators of lots of fluff, or a really successful contract to help them determine how to actually move forward? So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can leverage data in a very effective way here.
It's a lot to think about. Tim, I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show. It's really been great. I kind of have a mental checklist of homework for myself right now. No, I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Well, hey, I really appreciate you having me on. It's been a fun chat for sure.
This has been the Startup Defense.